So yes, hi, I'm Rituja, and today's tech panel and the theme for it is India's tech-led transition, the role of AI. This theme captures a pivotal moment in our nation's journey. India is no longer catching up. Sorry. Thank you so much. So yeah, coming back to the tech-led transition. India is no longer catching up. It is not inching forward. It is in fact leapfrogging. It is redefining the entire race. We are witnessing a shift where tech, which was once seen as a privilege, is now becoming the baseline, and we are writing that playbook. AI is now just not a tool, but a catalyst, which transforms precision farming in the rural Maharashtra to predictive healthcare in urban Delhi. Let us start this discussion where innovation meets intent. And to begin that, please welcome David Eaves, Associate Professor of Digital Government at the University College London and the Co-Deputy Director at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, a global vision on civic technology and digital transformation. His work has shaped the public sector innovation work worldwide. We are especially eager to hear his insights on India's pioneering digital public infrastructure and its implications. And it's his birthday, so we are really happy that he has made time to come with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I got asked to come talk a little bit about DPI, which I'll confess a little bit nervous because I feel I'm about to maybe try to India-splain what's happening in India to a room full of Indians, and so I'm a little bit nervous about that. But I do want to kind of share what I think is going on and what's interesting, this conversion from thinking from silos to infrastructure, what I think has made India's approach interesting, and then put that in a larger context, and what are some of the challenges I think that are ahead for both digital public infrastructure in general, but I think India as well specifically. So the first is just to talk a little bit about this movement from silos to infrastructure and my own journey on this. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been teaching about digital government and would actually convene digital leaders from around the world, from a huge range of countries. So like all these countries, we pull them together into a room to talk about everything that was going on that was interesting. And so there's Felipe from Brazil, and Sim, the CIO of Estonia. There's Mike Bracken, who started GDS in the UK. And so what was interesting to me in these meetings, though, was there were a couple of countries that I thought were doing really interesting work that did not have kind of a team in the kind of innovation team sense of the word that were doing really interesting work, and India was one of them. And the kind of theory of change that a lot of these groups had was, these countries were doing really interesting things and getting really interesting results. So over here during the pandemic, you have here's the United States, and it's huge sums of money that they're shipping out to people for COVID actually is ending up in the hands of the mob or others, and it was taking weeks to do. The cabinet would approve it, then it'd take weeks to print the checks, and the checks would have to go in the mail and eventually get to people, and they go to the wrong people. Meanwhile, in places like India or in Togo, these decisions were being made, and the money was appearing in people's bank accounts almost instantaneously. So you have Togo, literally one of the poorest countries in the world, I would argue vastly outperforming the way the United States was able to deliver public value in the middle of the pandemic. And one of the reasons for this is that a lot of governments really are kind of structured in a way that is kind of done in silos. So I have this very simple view of government where you have departments, they have applications they're running. So applications for me is any activity. So getting a passport, a driver's license, a health benefit. And then there's some sort of memory function to remember the transaction it did with you. And most governments are kind of structured like this. You've got your ministries, and they offer services, and for each one of those services, you've got to authenticate who you are, you've got to provide an address, some other information. Maybe you have a unique identifier, like your passport number, or your driver's license number. And then you fill out some form with a bunch of data that they need in order to provision the service, and then they store that in their own database in each ministry. And this is how most governments are organized. And the challenge with this is you get a lot of duplication. Like, so you go to one ministry's website, it looks totally different than another ministry's website. It looks totally different from another ministry's website. They call things different things. I lived in the United States for like 10 years. I was a resident alien, and like that thing would have a different meaning. Like, yeah, resident. My favorite's in the UK, like leave to remain. Like, what does that? Like, leave to remain? Like, I'm like, but so like you have all these different terms and nobody understands them, and you're terrified to make, as a person who's like not a citizen, you're terrified to make a mistake. Terrified to make a mistake. And the theory of change was, let's go in and change a service. We'll make it really amazing. Everybody will see how amazing it is, and they'll want to replicate that work in the ministry next door and the ministry next door. And actually, the story's way worse. It's not like you do that. If you like zoom in on one of those ministries, it's not like it does one thing. It does lots of things. And each one of those things has its own IT system, bespoke for solving that problem, that has its own unique identifier, has its own kind of like way of doing it. And so you get like lots of duplication, even within these given ministries, a fractal problem going on. And this was really slow work in these countries, and I was observing this. And so we're building these kind of monolithic systems that are doing very specific things that are highly inefficient, hard to change, and actually have like these terrible like public outcomes where you're spending huge sums of money to deliver public goods semi-effectively. And this is where I think India's approach, which is not unique, I'll talk about that in a second, not unique, but I think was very, very interesting and done at a scale that was previously unseen. And so India took this kind of infrastructure view, and so this is where I'm going to get a little bit nervous. Like, most of you probably know the DPI story, but there's like 5 people in the room who don't, so let's just bring them up to speed. So what is infrastructure thinking? Well, I always like to use highways as a way of explaining this. So the first highways built in the United States were built by Eisenhower. He came back from World War II. He'd taken this vacation in Germany, and he'd seen how the Germans were able to move things around very efficiently, and he said, oh, we need one of those. And the kind of original purpose for interest in the highways because you wanted to move military equipment around. You want to be able to defend yourself, to be able to move goods. The Germans were first on highways because the Germans have this historic problem of having the French and the Russians dislike them at the same time. So you got to like move things back and forth from east and west very quickly. So the original purpose is military. It's let's move equipment. But the genius of the highway was we're going to architect it for anybody to do anything they want on it. Very, very low permission. We don't ask you what you're doing when you get on the highway. We don't ask you where you're going, what you're going to do. All we care about is, do you have a legal driver's license and a legal car? If you've satisfied those conditions, off you go. Very, very low permission. And so all this explosion of use takes place on the highways, leisure, shipping, like everything we know about modern world, like suburbs, we used to be drive-in theaters, shopping malls, Amazon delivery, all of this stuff is leveraging that system. The other genius thing they did is they made the highway network interoperable with the existing road networks. So you had some state highways and you had local highways, same cars, same licensing system, same standards. So you have this intermodal way of moving between these networks, all maintained by this regulatory layer that determines like what's a safe car, what's the width of a lane, what's an appropriate curvature, what's a right signage. So this is really, Diane Coyle, who's here at Cambridge, and I just wrote a paper on the economics of digital public infrastructure, and I won't go into all this. The thing I really care the most about is interoperability. And that what you're really allowing is this stable interface is allowing a high variability layer and a low variability layer to communicate with each other and work. And what I mean by that is you can upgrade your car every single year, and you can pave the roads every 50 years, and they continue to work with each other. Continue to work with it because you have this stable interface. Your cell phone works the exact same way. Your apps are updating every 7 days. Your operating system, your iOS, is updating, every 6 weeks or 7 weeks. The phone is updating every year or 2, 5 if you're like me, try to be good about the world. But the thing that makes it all work is in that operating system is the cafe layer, which allows for interoperability between the apps and the hardware, which are evolving at different speeds. Okay, so what you now start to see is what I think the Indians were like, let's take that notion and apply it to the state. So let's move from the silos view into an infrastructure view where we would have services layer, a shared infrastructure components layer, and use that to organize the data that we have about citizens. And so your services could be public or private things, like getting a passport, getting a driver's license, all those types of things. And then we have all this data, that, like a registry of individuals, a registry of land, a registry of business. Governments are just registries. They're the source of truth for your society. And let's organize all those by creating this middle shared layer of common components which would allow us to now have high variability in the services, so they can evolve very, very quickly. Low variability on the data, we can update that on a frequent basis, but we could share them with each other, because if we could get a common, like, unique identifier for individuals, that would allow us to pull data from various sources to serve people more effectively. If we could have some sort of way to exchange value, we could give people money, or we could accept money from them in different ways. And if we had some sort of way to exchange data, we could make credentials and ideally in the long term, information more portable across various ministries. And those are the three core elements of the digital public infrastructure in India, which is Aadhaar for identity, UPI for payments, and DigiLocker for credentials. Okay. This is the kind of notion of what digital public infrastructure means. And so here is like this, what makes India interesting is it's one of the few places to kind of come in the middle and attack this middle infrastructure layer first, by, in 2009, launching Aadhaar, then DigiLocker, then UPI. And the kind of interesting thing about this is it allows you to start to assert control over other parts of the stack. So rather than making everybody refactor all of their services, you tell them, no, 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 just refactor the authentication. Let's just pull that in, and let's take that off your hands. Let's just refactor the payments. Let's create some nice rails, everybody move your payments onto UPI. Then let's do credentials. So you don't have to redo the whole service. You just start nibbling away, and you start standardizing across state, local, national government, private sector, public sector, whatever you want. And then you can also start to use it to begin, I don't think India's really started to do this, to start to organize your data. You can start using unique identifiers to start thinking about how might we do that. Okay. Really interesting impact. So one is there's this great reduction in the KYC costs of onboarding customers, which this cell phone provider capitalizes on and gets to 100 million users in the first 170 days, kind of virtually unheard of for scaling, particularly for a non-software company, for like actual hardware. And so you have this dramatic drop, which is actually helping the private sector deliver services more effectively. In addition to that, a kind of very interesting impact on banking, where India is claimed to have achieved in 5 years what normally takes countries 47 years in order to get bank accounts for the vast majority of its citizens. I think this study is interesting. I think much of the data out of India needs to be looked at pretty critically, so I don't want you to get overly excited. I think a lot of these bank accounts sit unused and empty, and so the kind of claim of the impact, I think, is not proportional to this number. But even if it was only 20% of these bank accounts were being used, that would still be a very significant accomplishment by any means. Okay. So you have these incredible impacts, and what you are ending up with, and this is one of the key things I wanted to drive at, is this what's referred to as the kind of the jam trinity, which is we get an identity system in place, and it may lower the KYC for getting people mobile access, which allows them to access their bank accounts and use UPI to exchange value, which makes it still more valuable for them to have an ID. And most important about what's going on in this trinity is you have public capital enabling a basic service that's drawing in private capital. And this, I think, is one of the things that India has done that is genuinely almost unique and more effective, which is really figuring out how to try to create ecosystems between the public and the private sector to pull more capital into the system to drive a flywheel that drives inclusion and access. Very, very interesting. It's not perfect, and I sometimes feel like it gets the impact gets overstated, but I also don't want us to understate the impact because real accomplishments have been going on. Let me just keep going. That's then led to kind of a second generation of infrastructure that's more sectoral focused. So once you can lay down that basic infrastructure of identity, payments, and credentials, now you can begin to think about, oh, well, what would it look like to have a set of shared components for education, for government, and for healthcare? I am the most excited about Digit. I think Digit has the potential of being a globally revolutionary system, but I think all of these are interesting. I think healthcare, let's hold our breath and see what happens. Okay. What is this? One thing I want to just do is just briefly tell you why I think this is interesting and talk about what others have done. So in the UK here, they didn't come in the middle. They came in on top. So everybody here in the UK has been to gov.uk, the website. Big deal, lots of awards, GDS, incredible work. Love that team. Think Mike Braxton's great. 2012, they founded gov.uk. And then after that success, though, they have adopted a little bit of an infrastructure story, which is if you're using Pay or if you're using Notify, if you're using One Login, which they've recently launched, this is the UK government's effort to try to mimic the Indian approach by building out infrastructure, not across all of society, but within the government. And then their hope is to then begin to organize the data. And I'm super proud. I built this slide in like 2013. Well, actually, 2015, and the data strategy had not happened, and then they've been following exactly. So they're coming in high and trying to tackle it this way. And so the Brazilians had kind of a pincer movement where they launched gov.br. I worked with this team a fair bit. They've got to 150 million users with 4,200 services, but they've actually, since the 1970s, had their data relatively centralized in a state-owned enterprise. And they're now kind of connecting those two things in a pincer, and they're starting to think about how do we build out our identity, our credentials, and our payment system. They've launched Pix, which is the world's fastest growing payment platform in the world, run by the National Bank. And nobody has their eyes on the Greeks. I'm writing something on Greek right now. I worked very closely with the minister here. They did the opposite. They came in low. They first grabbed hold of all the APIs for all the data. Then they started to kind of rationalize those, built out some common components, and then have launched a website. Okay. I don't want to go too long, but I want to share a few reflections about what I think is going on. So the first thing is, I love this quote, having been to India several times now, that everything is true about India, the opposite is true about India. And that is also true about this story. Indians did not invent digital public infrastructure. And the Indians definitely invented digital public infrastructure. Like, both these statements are true at the same time. And I say this because the Estonians have done very interesting work that's going all the way back to the 2000s. There are several other countries that have done kind of infrastructure-like plays. What I think the Indians have done is not that they invented it, but they did two things. One is they gave it stronger language and injected it into a global discourse in the way that few others have. Particularly during the G20. This is the definition we use, not the actual G20 definition, but I apologize. But really thinking about not just infrastructure for government, but infrastructure for the entire society. Infrastructure that's not just hardware, but infrastructure that is software. These, I think, are genuine and real contributions that India has made and has pulled the world's attention to this notion. This is the first thing. This is a selfish plug. My team at UCL, we've been spending the last 2 years mapping every single DPI we can find around the world, and you can go to the dpimap.org to do that. This conversation only exists because of India's contributions. The second thing I want to say is, I think India demonstrated that this approach works at scale. Like, I think India is interesting, but Estonia is interesting, but it's like 1.3 million people. It's really not demonstrating at the level scale. Singapore's done some interesting work, also like 5 million people, not really at scale. Working at a 1.4 billion person scale, I think, is a unique contribution that's very interesting. They also, I think, the big unique contribution is that India demonstrate the combinatorial power of using of this infrastructure. So many people have a digital identity. Some people, like almost everybody, has a payment rails. Few of them have as public payment rails. Very, very few people have a credentialing system. Almost no governments are using those in conjunction as a way to try to drive policy outcomes. That, I think, is a really fascinating piece that India has managed to do. Not always perfectly, but really, really, in a very compelling way that I think has captured people's attention. And then the third major contribution is that they really put public into the conversation about digital public infrastructure. Not that this should be an entirely private approach or all handed off to the private, but there actually is a public interest that exists in this, and we need to assert that public interest in some sort of way. And I think that part of the conversation has been deeply inspiring to a large number of countries around the world. But they're not caught up in only public. Again, I want to just reiterate, India's ability to draw in private capital, I think, has been critically important. And there is a world where all of this could just be private. There are companies that would like nothing more than for all of this infrastructure to be entirely privately managed and privately provisioned. Okay, I do want to say, I think there is still much work to do in India, and I would say, I think the story around governance in India is not as strong as the Indian government thinks that it is. The story around the creation of governance for Aadhaar was somewhat ad hoc, and I'm not sure is really a model that most countries are looking for. And there's this continuing debate around kind of like what I think the Cold War, I used to call it the Cold War between the Indian government and civil society over what privacy means and how far Aadhaar actually extends. That Cold War for the last 3 years is now starting to end as the Indian government starts to assert, no, actually, we're going to go do these things. We had this like 3-year period after the court ruling where civil society said we've won and the government said we won, and nobody wanted to test what that winning actually meant, and the government's now like, I think we're ready to test. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but that engagement with civil society, I think that could be stronger. And then finally, as a totally shameless plug, I do have these 3 reports about DPI, that one written with Diane Coyle here at Cambridge, one with Mariana at UCL, and then one with a colleague of mine at UCL as well. If you want to know more about what we're thinking and what we're writing about, please feel free to use those QR codes. But I hope this was like a helpful introduction for those who didn't know digital public infrastructure, and for the vast majority that do. I hope I have reflected your country in a way that is challenging but fair, and I did not have to India-splain India to you, because that would be terrifying. Thank you so much.